everyone to our October Folklore Lunch lecture. It's part of our series. Those who aren't familiar, we have a luncheon every a month during the school term where we like to showcase some of our graduate students that are on campus, that are working with materials that relate to Ukrainian folklore, literature, full house company. Today's lecture is on the life of Borys Liatoshynsky, what a composer's name can tell us about our cultural space. And it's being presented by Illia, who is a graduate student working on his MA in Modern Languages and Cultural Studies, specifically studying Borys Liatoshynsky, but also looking at how music is represented in graphic narratives. And so he's kind of merged those two disciplines together and is hopefully, in the near future, will be presenting a thesis to us. Anyway, Illia is a graduate student here and a member of the communications team, newly brought in as part of our team at the Folklore Center. And he is building on a foundation laid during his interdisciplinary music cultural studies BA program at the Ukrainian National Tchaikovsky Academy of Music. Illia focuses on exploring how music, in its broad sense, is portrayed across various non-sounding artistic media. So, in particular case, graphic novels, that we don't usually hear sound from them, but sound is represented in them in many cases. His current research examines representation of music in the graphic narratives, such as comics and graphic novels, and he has been collaborating with a graphic artist as well to see how he can interpret Borys Liatoshynsky's biography. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Illia to share with us a little bit more about his studies.
Thank you so much, Larissa, for this introduction. And oh my God, thank you so much for coming, taking the time. I'm impressed so many people came. Well, yeah, thank you for finding the time to listen about this fascinating composer. I will start a little bit from the present, and then we'll go and travel back in time and learn about his biography, his life, and his influence on the modern Ukraine. So I would like to start by telling you about why this composer, why I chose him as a figure for my future thesis. So as you know, I finished this higher education institution, and it was in 2021. And afterwards, I was still looking for the news regarding, related to the conservatory. Some of my friends are still studying there, so I was more or less being updated on what is happening. And last year, in March 2023, I was surprised by reading about the news that there are protests happening outside of the conservatory, and which was never happening before. I didn't remember any protests during my BA program. And basically, the students and professors were unhappy with the name of the conservatory, that it has Tchaikovsky name in it. As you can see on the next slide, it's being presented as a brand from our conservatory. Right now, they are saying that the conservatory is 160 years old, but before you could also see his portrait immediately when you were entering the website. And on the right, you see Maxim Timoshenko, who is the rector or president or principal of the Music Academy. And as you can see, he has a huge Tchaikovsky portrait behind him. And basically, there were two camps. One camp was students and professors who were against having Tchaikovsky name in the conservatory name. The other camp was the rector himself and some other professors. And I would be surprised if some students are as well. I saw some statistic, and it said that it was 75% were against Tchaikovsky and 25% were okay with his name staying.
And basically, it's a very interesting controversy, very interesting story. I don't want to take too much time from talking about Liatoshynsky, because I will do a bad, like it wouldn't look very nice if I will talk about Tchaikovsky more than Liatoshynsky. But in general, I just want you to understand why people were against him. But I first will tell you the position that Maxim Tomoshenko holds, because they released in 2020 a book about Tchaikovsky. It's called Tchaikovsky, Ukraine on the Map of Life and Creativity. So, and in this book, in the introduction, which was written by Maxim Tomoshenko, he basically says that Tchaikovsky's oeuvre has an explicit Ukrainian heritage in it, since the composer has ancestral ties to the Ukrainian Cossacks elite, and several times used Ukrainian folklore themes, both musical and literature, in his works, which played a significant role in this musical language. And also, he kind of helped establish the academy itself by visiting it one time in 1890, it was still like a college back there, not the conservatory. And all of these statements are a little bit like they're not completely true. They're like half truth, because if you'll dig deeper, we will see that he also has French heritage, and he also has some other like influences from other literatures and other cultures. So Ukraine for him was mostly just as an inspiration, but not specifically because he felt himself Ukrainian. He clearly stated that he is Russian and he enjoys Russian culture. He was a strong supporter of imperial Russian politics, specifically during the Russo-Turkish War, and everything can be seen in his letters. Like he never used word Ukraine in his letters. He always called it Malorossia, small Russia, and also people of the Ukraine, he was calling them Khokhly. So that's I wouldn't say that it sounds very like he was Ukrainian in his heart. And also, it is important to say that as the Ukrainian musicologist Alla Zahaitchkevich, I really enjoyed her talk about this theme. She says, "Our enemy is by no means Tchaikovsky himself, but rather his simulacrum, the namesake Soviet and Putinist ideological brand, which ties us down, strips us of freedom, and turns us into hostages of a dead tradition. I firmly believe that the Academy cannot continue to operate under this brand in the context of war. It is unacceptable and even immoral." So what she says is that we're not particularly against Tchaikovsky as a person. I mean, nobody is a saint. He was a human being, and so on. And and she even says that it is difficult for us to admit, and even harder to let go of the name Tchaikovsky, as it has become almost literally ingrained in our collective musical body, long felt like a part of us, familiar and dear. It is embedded in our shared past, sanctified by memories, illuminating by hopes, and even visualized in the modern media images of the Academy as its very identity. Yeah, so nobody was against Tchaikovsky before the war. We were learning about his music, everybody were playing him, and so, but nowadays we come to see that he is being used as a propaganda marker, as a propaganda machine. Like his name is being used to conquer new cultural spaces. And I read a very interesting article where they say that, for example, after the Soviet troops entered Tallinn as capital of Estonia in 1944, the first thing they made in the opera theater is they staged the Eugene Onegin, the famous opera by Tchaikovsky, specifically that year in winter to celebrate that now it's a part of Soviet Union. And also, for example, another example is that when Soviet troops entered Uzhhorod, a city in far western Ukraine, in 1945, they established the Uzhhorod Children's Music School, which also had the name of Tchaikovsky. And Tchaikovsky had close to zero relation to this city and this music school, but it was a marker. If it's a Tchaikovsky music school, then it's the part of a Russian world or a part of the empire. Therefore, it definitely looks a little bit weird that our music academy in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, still bears his name, and by this we kind of still identify, like people from the outside can still look at, say, oh, they still have Tchaikovsky's name in their conservatory, so they're still kind of like in this sphere of influence and so on, and we are trying to escape it and look at something else. And then, what can be something else? And then I saw that people are suggesting Liatoshynsky, to have Liatoshynsky's name in the conservatory. And I also would like to introduce you to another Ukrainian composer, Illia Tchaikovsky. And in one interview, she expressed very convincingly, very eloquently, why we should choose Liatoshynsky. And this will be a kind of like a short teaser to my talk. She says, if our conservatory was named after Borys Liatoshynsky, we would be talking to the world about entirely different meanings. This would mean that our musical culture is connected with our 1920s, futurism, and silent cinema. Our contemporaries, Valentin Silvestrov, Yevhen Stankovich, Leonid Grabovsky, and Sviatoslav Krutikov, who learned from Liatoshynsky, contributed to European symphonism, modernism, and avant-garde. Taking such a step would mean that we finally defeated Stalinism. So I think this is quite straightforward arguments why we should change the name. And in my following talk, I will be just more or less explaining what she means by all of this information. And without further ado, let's talk about Liatoshynsky. Who he is? Who is Borys Liatoshynsky? Usually in universities or in schools, music schools, we hear that he is a key figure in modern classical music in Ukraine, or as we could say, like modern art music, Western art music in Ukraine. A center that has combined the musical traditions of several eras. And this is very true, but what's interesting about Liatoshynsky is that despite he's always being portrayed as the father of contemporary Ukrainian classical music, there are not really that much information about him, because we don't have the last biography about him was written in 70s, still in the Soviet Union, and since then we don't have any big monography, big biography of Liatoshynsky that was written in contemporary Ukraine. And when I was preparing for this lecture in the past, I had to look through on different small articles, Soviet biographies, some hidden dissertations they had to find, and create this kind of image of him, trying to look at the previous biographies critically, and to also understand who Liatoshynsky is, not as a cultural and historical figure, but also who he is as a person, because he liked cats, for example, and so on. It's very very interesting who he was, because we only know him as a mosaic or as an icon, some historical figure, but it's interesting who he was as a person. So let's look at the beginning. So Borys Liatoshynsky, he was born in 1895 on January 4th. So this means that soon, this January, it will be an anniversary of his birth. It will be 130 years since his birth. He was born in Zhytomyr. You can see on the map it's on the little bit eastern of Kyiv Oblast. Back then, Zhytomyr was very very international city. Lots of different nationalities, different religions, like Catholics, Orthodox people, a huge population of Jewish people, and so on and so forth. Liatoshynsky himself, he had a mixed heritage. His father was Polish and his mother was Ukrainian. And his father roots is said to be even connected to the Polish nobility. He was, in Soviet biographies, they are saying that he was from the family of intelligentsia, not to say that he was from the nobility, because his father was a historian. He was principal in several gymnasiums in which Liatoshynsky was studying. On the left you can see his family house, which was unfortunately just destroyed, and not during Second World War or First World War. It was destroyed in the 80s, just because nobody really paid attention to it, unfortunately. But now we have Liatoshynsky Park close to the place where was his house. Here you can see his family, and I think he got his first music education from his mother, as it was quite common in that period of time, because women were often learning how to play musical instruments. So his mother, she knew how to play the piano and sing very well. So she taught him a little bit, and then he went and started studying in musical college in Zhytomyr. And there he was his composition teacher was actually Alexander Różycki, who was also he was Polish. He got his education from Warsaw Conservatory, and he was teaching him in a very romantic way. He was writing music back then in a style of Chopin, lots of mazurkas, lots of nocturnes, very romantic and very very Polish, because he also felt himself Polish. So he was even signing his early works as Borys Yaksa, to mention these Yaksa-Liatoshynsky roots. And also there was in this college there was a piano teacher, Teofil Richter, and he was, if you maybe know, he's a father of Sviatoslav Richter, very famous pianist who was born in Ukraine, and he lived a little bit in Odessa and then moved to Moscow. Well, after graduation in 1913, he moved to Kyiv. His whole family moved to Kyiv, and he. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. So this is his early works, and there in Kyiv there is a cabinet of Liatoshynsky, still preserved in that old stage. And in this closet, you can see on the right, there are lots of manuscripts, and they are still being waited to being looked through and created, so people could create an editions of his early works, of this autumn fantasy, for example. Because there are almost no recordings. I couldn't find any recording to show you of his early works, just so you could hear the music. So this is the job for the future generation, for sure. So he started studying in Kyiv. He was actually doing 2 degrees at the same time. He was studying law at Kyiv University, which is now the University of Shevchenko in Kyiv, and also he was taking at first private lessons from Reinhold Glier, and then he also entered the conservatory as his pupil, and he was teaching him composition. Reinhold Glier, he's also Polish. He's very important figure for Ukrainian music. He was born in Kyiv, and he two of his students became one of the most important composers for Ukrainian classical music. It was Borys Liatoshynsky and Levko Revutsky. And he was a great pedagogue. He was a great teacher. He studied in St. Peter, in Moscow Conservatory, and he received an education from all the famous Russian composers, like Rimsky-Korsakov, like Taneyev. His fellow students were Alexander Scriabin and so on and so forth. So he had strong roots into this tradition. So he was teaching those style of musicking, so to say. And Liatoshynsky loved him, really. He was. We have his letters, a letter exchange between Glier and Liatoshynsky, and we can read all those letters and see how deep their connection was. And Liatoshynsky was saying that he was not only a wonderful music teacher, but also a great teacher of life. And I will just make a short step outside and just tell how all these letters were collected, because it's an interesting story. So one musicologist from academy she was married to Liatoshynsky's student, and once she discovered that in Moscow, in archive, they have all these letters that Liatoshynsky was sending to Glier. And so she convinced people in Moscow that, please, this is very important composer for Ukraine, please give it to me. And they gave her the copies, I guess, and she came back to Ukraine and created this edition of his letters exchange. Both letters that Liatoshynsky was sending to Glier and letters that Glier was sending to Liatoshynsky, and that's how we got all this information. And this is invaluable, of course, information for the people who will be writing future biography, I hope, of Liatoshynsky. Well, so that was a very turbulent time, right? Because the First World War was happening, and then the revolution, and Liatoshynsky finished. He finished his degree in 1918. So at that time, there was already a Ukrainian Republic formed in Kyiv. And his first, final project, final piece of music that he wrote to get the degree was his first symphony. Yeah, I will talk about this. So his first symphony, and this is actually the first opus, so to say, that he marked. He says, this is my opus number 1. So all his short little pieces for piano he was writing before that time, they're not important because they were still, he was studying, he was not perfect. But now this was good enough for him, so he marked it as his opus number 1. And now, I guess, let's listen to some music, and you will hear how his style was sounding back at that time. Yeah, so as you can hear, he initially showed that his style is very dramatic, very energetic, and he will not change throughout his other life, and it will always will be like this, very passionate, and sometimes even too much. But yes, I like this, and this work is very important because could you believe it or not? But before that time, there were almost no symphonies from Ukrainian composers. It was unfortunate, but we only have maybe one symphony from a composer called Tchaikovsky in 19th century, and after that, nobody was trying to write it. Like we have one of the most important composers in Ukraine, Mykola Lysenko, and he was writing some operas, some piano music, but no symphonies from him, unfortunately. So Liatoshynsky, by making this symphony, he created one of the few symphonies that Ukrainian composers wrote. It's also important to mention that Liatoshynsky, by graduating from the conservatory at that time, he became one of the first composers who graduated from the higher musical education institution in Ukraine. Because before that, everybody were traveling to Germany, to Austria, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, because there they could get a higher education. in music. But since the conservatory was established in 1913, and Liatoshynsky entered it and got his education, and he was completely formed as a composer being in Ukraine, in Kyiv. That's very important. He was one of the first professional composers that was raised and educated in Ukraine. From the sound of this music, I like the description that it can be it now sounds like Chopin, but with dissonances, as people were describing Alexander Scriabin music, because this is where lots of influences from Scriabin can be heard in this symphony. And he was writing in the style of symbolism, connected to the poetry style of symbolism. And it can be considered, people usually call it late Romanticism period, and Liatoshynsky was still in this style. But as you will see in the future, he will completely change. He will change his style completely and enter something like a different stage, especially after the 1990s, 1918 years, because they were very turbulent, very violent, because first it was Russian Empire, then it was Ukrainian Republic, then it became again Soviet Union, and also there were Ukrainian republics, then it was different Ukrainian Republic with different leaders. So it was always power struggle and lots of violence. So all of this influenced him in the further years. So after the graduation, and during his studying, he also found his future wife, Margarita Tsarevich. They had a happy marriage, the great marriage. The only problem was that they didn't have children, unfortunately. But they adopted Margarita's niece as their daughter after the Second World War. Margarita was also studying in the conservatory. She was a great piano player. She was playing all of Liatoshynsky's work, and her family was all musicians. So they were spending time by playing in like 4 hands in the same piano, 8 hands, like having like musical evenings every week and so on. And the interesting thing that they met because her family invited Liatoshynsky to teach her harmony and music theory. And she was already in the conservatory the first year, and Liatoshynsky was still taking only private lessons, but they still hired him to teach her some harmony. And then they fell in love. So in 1920s, after his graduation, he began teaching in the conservatory immediately. So some of the students there were older than him because he was only 22, perhaps. But he was already a professor teaching music theory, composition. Very interesting detail that he joined the Mykola Leontovich Music Society that was formed in 1921. And when you hear about this, you say, okay, well, yeah, he joined Union of the Composers. That's great, Mykola Leontovich. But if you know the Mykola Leontovich biography, you will know that he was murdered the same year by the NKVD, like by Cheka agent, in his own house. And they created this Mykola Leontovich Music Society in memory of him, of Leontovich. So composers knew that something bad happened to him, and they created this society, and Liatoshynsky joined them immediately. In this Mykola Leontovich Music Society, they kind of created another division called the Contemporary Music Association. And it was a place for specifically radical composers that were writing avant-garde music, and they were learning all the new stuff from the West, like Schoenberg, Berg, the Hindemith, all the famous composers in avant-garde style from the West. And Liatoshynsky even went to Moscow to listen Alban Berg opera Wozzeck in that year, and yeah, it was everything was new for them. And you will hear it in his new opuses. Unfortunately, they didn't last very long because in the late 20s, there was a different union of composers created, which were more about proletarian music, music for the mass, or music of the mass. And basically, they said that you are too progressive, you are too like formalist, too bourgeois, and your music is not being listened by the public. So they had to close this association. And in general, as you know from the history of the Ukrainian poetry, about Ukrainian writers, that in the beginning of the 20s, things were good because Soviet Union was inviting, like innovations, new styles in art, and so on. But in the late 20s, they started slowly to, or not very slowly, to close all the opportunities for the artists to create something new, something innovative, and they all had to start writing in the specific social realistic style, and even in music specifically. So now I would like you to listen to his piano piece called Reflections. And here you will see the completely different style, completely different approach to music making. And I am a big fan of this pianist. His name is Antoni Baryshevsky. He was also he graduated from Music Academy in Kyiv, and he does a very great interpretation of this piece. I think that's enough. So, as you can see, nothing is left from Chopin. It's a completely different language, musical language, atonal language, no familiar tonalities or chords. And it's also an interesting, this cycle of small piano pieces called Reflections is an interesting cycle because the reflections here are not exactly a visual metaphor. It's not about like reflections on the water or something like this. It's more about the structural reflections. I haven't like analyzed this work meticulously, but basically Liatoshynsky here introduces to us chord structures, and then he starts to reflect them in different inversions, like in the polyphonic works. So that was his one of interesting pieces from that period of time. Yeah, the new language, ethnology, the new form, reflections. It's 7 pieces, and I'm actually doing my thesis research project based on this cycle from Liatoshynsky. But in my research project, I will have 7 short stories instead of 7 musical pieces. So in 1930s, Liatoshynsky was lucky because, as you know, from Ukrainian writers, And poets, the late 20s were awful, and 30s were awful. Lots of people were killed, lots of people were imprisoned, sent to Siberia, or they had to just stop writing. But for Liatoshynsky, it was not too bad. He found his place. He created 2 operas in this period. He was writing for the cinema, as he was saying, specifically to get some money. Maybe he was ashamed of it, or I don't know. And then, very importantly, in cooperation with Ukrainian writer and poet Maxim Rylsky and his colleague and friend Levko Revutsky, composer, they created a new edition of Mykola Lysenko's opera Taras Bulba. It's one of the most famous Ukrainian operas, especially in Ukraine. It's the number one. But the problem was that before they made the second edition, the opera was unpopular. It was not staged in the theater because I guess people didn't like the Lysenko's edition of this opera. But after they worked on it, changed the orchestration, changed the libretto, made it more condensed, people suddenly loved it. And since then, this opera is being staged in Ukraine every year without skip. And maybe you heard if you heard the Ukrainian song "Zasvit vstale Kozachenki" in this opera, in the overture, you hear the grandiose orchestral arrangement of this song. So here you can see he was also collaborating with a famous Ukrainian cinema director, Alexander Dovzhenko. He was writing a score for his film Ivan. And to his operas. By the way, the opera Zolotay Obruch, the Golden Ring, it was for a while forgotten as well after its first stage, its first production. But not so long ago, 1 year ago, they made it again. They staged it in Kyiv, and you could even watch this opera online for 1 year, which was great news. So this is an interesting, like a counterpoint, or like that. Usually in the biographies, you read that this time was awesome. Like Liatoshynsky was creating so many interesting work. He was so creative, and his career was going well. But if you read his letters, he was actually quite bored, and he was saying that everything is the same here, empty and dead. There are no chamber or symphonic concerts, of course, and even decent musicians are absent. Everyone lives here at the first opportunity, everyone who can. We feel like we are just in a swamp in Kyiv right now. So he was definitely unhappy with music life in Kyiv back then, and it's understandable because the city was damaged during the war, and also the Soviets moved the capital from Kyiv to Kharkiv for 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. So during 20s, Kyiv was not the capital of Ukraine, so all the important cultural life was happening in Kharkiv back then, and Liatoshynsky was it reminds me sometimes when people in Edmonton are saying, "Oh, it's so boring here in Edmonton. I wish I would be living in Toronto or somewhere else." But the important thing that Liatoshynsky, he stayed. He never left Kyiv. He lived in Kyiv his whole life. Never took an opportunity. Maybe he just didn't have an opportunity. But in the hindsight, we can see that it was very important for him to stay in Kyiv and not to go to Moscow. Because if he would go to Moscow, we would just lose him. He would become another Russian composer or Soviet composer. Coming next. When he wrote his second symphony in 1936, that was his first clash with the party, first clash with the authorities, because it was the first time when they said that he's too formalistic. And what does it mean to be a formalist? It basically means that your creations are being influenced by the Western music, by the Western art. You're writing too complex music, hard to understand for the masses, or something like this. And with this symphony, there was a curious episode because it was firstly successfully premiered in Kyiv, and then later Liatoshynsky planned to have the next rendition in Moscow, but plans were cancelled due to the assassination of a party official in Moscow, so the concert was cancelled, and nobody heard the symphony. But despite this, the reviews in the newspaper Pravda, very important newspaper in the Soviet Union, they released a review, a critical review about this symphony, accusing it of formalism, even though nobody heard it in Moscow. Yeah, so it all just shows that it was a planned sabotage or something like this. Yeah, the struggle against formalism affected almost all cultural figures of the USSR, who tried to modernize their creations even slightly through Western influence. The peak of this campaign happened in 1948, when the Communist Party issued a decree on the opera The Great Friendship by Ivano Morodelli, which was also, these accusations also affected Dmitry Shostakovich, Sergei Prokofiev, Aram Khachaturian, as well as Borys Liatoshynsky. Later, this, and one of the critics, they were saying about the Second Symphony, the anti-people formalistic trend in Ukrainian music art was manifested primarily in the works of the composer Borys Liatoshynsky. Particularly alien to the artistic tastes of Soviet people is the Second Symphony by Liatoshynsky. This work is disharmonious, cluttered with thunderous sounds of the orchestra that are not justified by anything, which oppresses the listener. And as for the melody, the symphony is poor and colorless. Sorry. So after this, after this paragraph, let's listen to it. Let's listen if it's really that bad. As you heard, I don't think it's too bad. I think it's quite good. Yeah, so, okay, let's move on. Then, oh, sorry, I forgot to translate this. So this is the period of Second World War. And Liatoshynsky had to evacuate from Kyiv because but before that, sorry, I missed my slides. So when the Second World War started, as you know, the Soviets first allied with Germany and divided Poland, and conquered occupied the western part of Ukraine, Lviv in particular. And there were all these composers in Lviv, these Polish heritage, Polish composers. And so Liatoshynsky was helping them because he knew Polish language very well, he could understand it. And he was organizing concerts for them in Kyiv. And in response, as a thank you, they were sending him the German wine or Austrian wine, the Frau Milch, because in Kyiv you couldn't get this, so they were saying it because they were still could find it in the stores. Then when the Germans started attacking and occupied Kyiv, Liatoshynsky had to evacuate, and he was sent to Saratov city in deep Russia. And there he was living, but he had a chance to work because they created a radio, Ukrainian radio, in the name of Taras Shevchenko. And so Liatoshynsky was writing lots of music for this radio. And all of them were on Ukrainian. Had a Ukrainian theme. Lots of arrangements of Ukrainian folk songs, string quintet. He started working on his third symphony, and some very beautiful piano preludes. I will show you one in the end. And all of them have this sort of melancholic feel. I could definitely understand it when you're far away from home. You think about the life before the war and all these feelings. He was expressing them in his music. And now I would like you to listen to a very important musical piece by him. It's a Ukrainian quintet, and it was based on 5 Ukrainian themes. And yes, let's just give a listen. In this episode, in this musical piece, you can hear that he a little bit changed his musical language. He didn't want to be accused of formalism anymore, so he was trying to write a little bit more accessible, not so many dissonances, but definitely the Ukrainian themes, Ukrainian folklore songs, you can hear them in his music very, very much. So let's move to his third symphony. The third symphony, it was again. The Soviet government didn't have any problems with his chamber works, like works for piano, for violin, for trio, for quintet. But they definitely had some problems with his symphonies because Third Symphony, it marked again a big clash between Liatoshynsky and the Soviet government. He was writing this symphony, or at least thinking about it, for more than 10 years. He started conceiving the idea in late 30s, and then he had a time during the Second World War in evacuation to gather some information, some music references from the folklore music for this symphony. And then finally, after the war, he finished the first manuscript, the first edition in 1951. And then and he planned to release it to make a rendition in the winter same year. But it was already not very good weather for Ukrainian artists back then, because in the same year, 1951, during the meeting, a famous Ukrainian poet, Volodymyr Sosura, was accused of nationalism for his poem Love Ukraine, and some other Ukrainian composers were also accused of formalism. So, well, in the hindsight, not surprisingly, when Liatoshynsky released his symphony, he was also accused of formalism. And first they listened to it in Kyiv, then they immediately called to Moscow, said that he wrote the formalism again. And then, so even when they sent the recording to Moscow so they could listen to it, they were already like biased, and they said that it's bad. But what is interesting, that they played this symphony at the performance on October 25th, and people were astonished by it. They gave him 15-minute ovation after the symphony finished, and the witnesses said that they never seen so many people in the Philharmonic listening to the symphony. Here, but the consequences for Liatoshynsky were devastating, especially for you, because you are working in the university or studying. You will understand, because he's saying, "I am completely neglected now. No commissions, nothing. They took away my composition class at the conservatory," which means he was not able to teach his students composition. "Besides, I've been removed from some committees, the arts committee, publishing, and the like. But by the way, for some time I thought I would be expelled from the conservatory, which would be catastrophic. They conducted a thorough evaluation of my class with the whole committee. I feel terrible because I am, as a result of everything, I have completely disappeared from all concerts and radio programs. In short, for now, I am as good as dead as a composer. And when I will resurrect, I don't know." This is a very famous quote. In the end, lots of people are quoting it very much. And as you can see, so he as a composer, he could not write works. He could not earn money. He barely had any classes in the university. And if he had classes, there was somebody sitting and watching him doing his class in the same room. And so here, just to move a little bit faster, I would like to show you another music example from this third symphony. But I chose this very interesting documentary made in the late 70s. And this is the documentary about the rehearsal process of the orchestra with Ukrainian conductor Stefan Turchak. And this is how they were rehearsing. Very interesting video.
Попрошу, 3 такти до 170. Ще раз. Да.
Okay, so just to move a little bit quicker because we're running out of time, the main problem with this symphony was the finale, because it was tragic. And Liatoshynsky wrote that in the end, I quote, that the peace will win the war. But the finale was tragic. So some people are suggesting that can be interpreted that even after the Second World War was over, for people who were fighting it and defeated the Nazism. They came back to the Soviet Union, but it was still the not democratic society. They had troubles because of their nationalities, because they were like captured by the Germans and then being captive as prisoners. But when they were coming back to the Soviet Union, they were still accused of being collaborating with Germans and so on. So maybe they thought that Liatoshynsky kind of had a secret message in this symphony, and he had to rewrite the finale and make it very happy, optimistic, and like the good guys have won, and so on. Anyway, during his time of struggles, he was always coming back to Vorzel, to his wife's village, dacha. Like they had a house there in the nature where he could create and have a nice time. They had lots of squirrels. He was feeding the squirrels. They were all over the place. And yeah, it's just some pictures from Vorzel. And after Stalin died, it got a little bit easier for everybody, as you probably know, and as well as for Liatoshynsky. He was no longer being accused of formalism. He wrote 2 more symphonies, a couple of piano concertos, and everything was good. Even more, he had an opportunity to travel to musical festivals outside at least the Soviet Union, into the countries of into Poland, or also to Belgium. And in Poland, they had this festival called Warsaw Autumn. And this was very, very interesting, very important musical festival, because they were playing specifically avant-garde music there. So all the new genres, all the new composers, new styles, as you can see here, like Stockhausen, John Cage, Pierre Boulez. This was very new music, very unusual. And Liatoshynsky, after being in this kind of like musical vacuum, because you could not get any new music when you were in the Soviet Union, he was going there and listening to them, and he was amazed. He had some Polish friends who were helping him as well, and they were giving him recordings, and Liatoshynsky was bringing these recordings with him to Kyiv. And when he had lessons with his students, teaching them composition, he was showing those plates to them, playing them, so they were listening to those plates and getting inspired. And by this, he created a whole new generation of Ukrainian composers. It's surprising how many of them are famous Ukrainian composers nowadays. Like Valentin Silvestrov is probably the most famous among them. I mean, on Spotify he has like almost 700,000 plays, so that's like, I was surprised when I saw how many people are listening to Silvestrov. Also, Yevhen Stankovich, he's working in the academy, the prominent Ukrainian composer. Lisa Dichko, she is one of the biggest composers for choir, specifically choir music. Vitaly Hodzatsky, he, for example, created a musical piece inspired by the processes in the atomic bomb, like nuclear processes or something like this, because he was writing it during the Cuba crisis. So basically and also Igor Shamo, another composer, he was also taught by Liatoshynsky, and he wrote the famous anthem of Kyiv, like «Як тебе не любити, Києва мій». And they're all his students. And in the end, I just would like to read some of their references, so to say, about their teacher. So Yevhen Stankovich is saying, what kind of person was Borys Mykolaievich? He was delicate, intelligent, and decent. I have met very few people like him in my life. For him, the ethics of human relationships mattered greatly. Concepts like honesty, decency, concise, everything on which the world should stand. These qualities were fully inherited in Borys Liatoshynsky. He helped every one of his students in every way he could. He treated people with compassion. Yeah, it's very important sentence here, because we know that Liatoshynsky was helping his students if they were being accused of formalism or like being not honest to the Soviet Union or something like this. For example, some of these students were accused and being rejected from this composers union in the Soviet Union. So they were also having troubles. And Liatoshynsky was always helping them because he knew how it feels. And another quote, I like it very much. So this is from Valentin Silvestrov. Sometimes our entire group would visit him at his dacha in Vorzel, where he lived for a long time. I even went there with Larissa, my future wife, to introduce her to Borys Nikolaevich. I remember how we, myself, Leonid Grabovsky, Vitaly Godzatsky, and Igor Blashkov discussed various issues of contemporary avant-garde music while our conversation took place in the Vorzel forest. Liatoshynsky said that avant-garde music lacks a cohesive thematic unity and a clear intonation melodic structure. It is constantly breaking apart, yielding to the rhythm of sharp leaps and intonational rhythmic jerks. And it was during this time, in the midst of his reflections, that a squirrel jumped on his shoulder from a tree. An interesting analogy came to mind in response to his remarks about avant-garde music. I said, Borys Nikolaevich, we, your students, composing avant-garde music are like the squirrel that jumps from branch to branch with sharp leaps. And I found a picture of Liatoshynsky's wife, Margarita Tsarevich, with a squirrel on her shoulder. Well, this is almost the end. And now I would like to come back to the initial quote from Zahaikevich. So now you can see why this would mean that our musical culture is connected with our 1920s, because Liatoshynsky was one of those. Futurism, silent cinema, his contemporaries, Valentin Silvestrov, Yansnikovich, all the famous composers learned from him. And this would, and of course, we will defeat Stalinism if we will choose him as a composer of the academy, because he was one of the accused by Stalin, but he survived and he remained as a major figure in Ukrainian classical music in Ukraine. And just to finish it off with some more music, I would like to show you one last piano piece by Liatoshynsky, which he created also while being evacuated. It's a prelude, and it has epigraph by Shevchenko. Oh, sorry, it's so small.
Сонце заходить.
Yeah, Сонце заходить. Yeah. So let's listen to this. And let's finish it here because I'm already over the 1 hour. Thank you so much.